Thank you, Prime Minister. Just a couple of points to update. We have had some more progress today. They're now up to about 54 tonnes that have been pumped since last evening. Of course, we'd all like to see more, but that is an improvement in progress through the day today. The Solvals have been putting a booster pump in place to help boost the flow rate between the Wina and the Awanuia, and that should be kicking off shortly. They've also been today preparing to set up a tap system on the starboard number 5 tank. We're working on the port number 5 tank at the moment, which is the one with 270 tonnes. The starboard number 5 is the one that's largely underwater, quite difficult to access. It's about 358 tonnes that they're proceeding to prepare that to enable pumping. They're also continuing to work on options to get some heat into the oil to increase its potential flow rate. That remains challenging. The engine room of the vessel is partially submerged, and they have to get some sort of heat from some of the engines there to be able to do the job, or bring some heat in from elsewhere. Both of those options are pretty flawed, but they are working on that today. In terms of the oil response, we could describe it yesterday. I think it's fair to say that we're at the end of the first stage of the oil spill response. There hasn't been much further oil added to the beaches today, although occasionally you get weathered oil coming in different parts. So currently standing down some of the teams to have a rest and to be ready for the next stage, which will undoubtedly occur at some point, particularly with the weather starting to be a bit rough tonight. So we will need more volunteers, and the Army will need to be back here on force at some point. And again, I stress that we are expecting more oil at some stage through the week with all the variables in relation to the ship. The other point to note, some of you are aware that I met with the MSC management team today, Phil Abrahams and Kevin Clark from Australia. Really to have a discussion around 2 key points, giving them a clear understanding of how New Zealanders feel about what's happened here, and getting a clear understanding from them as to how they see their role in the cleanup. Again, I wasn't talking about legal liability, just more the moral obligation to assist given their involvement with that vessel, and they have given me an undertaking that they will be looking to provide assistance in both cash and non-cash terms, and they've already gone to Tauranga since that meeting, and I understand they're going to update me further tomorrow. So that's questions.
How much do you think that the cleanup operation is going to cost?
We literally don't know. There's just too many variables at this point. Basically around how much of that oil comes off the ship and when and in what way. And currently the cost is somewhere around $4 million for the oil spill response part. We had officials in on Friday to discuss what it was likely to cost. And of course their first question was, well, how long is this going to go on for, Minister? And the answer is we just don't know at this point because of all the variables associated with both the ship and the weather, and how long it stays on the reef in one position.
Those estimates out there of tens of millions, is that possible?
It's possible. There's a range of numbers that are possible. We could go through any number of them.
What's the daily cost?
Daily costs, again, a little bit hard to say at this point. Of the 4 million, some of that money is involved in setup and working through to try and come up with an estimate of the daily cost. And again, that depends very much on the status of the operation, because at some times we are in a sort of lull currently because the cost as much has been fired up. But the officials are working on those estimates.
They haven't given you a daily estimate?
No, they haven't.
Do you have any information on the time?
In what respect?
Well, at the moment, and how long it's going to take to get the oil off the ship, whether you know, I know whether you're going to do that or how long it's going to go on.
Just way too many variables, I'm sorry. There is 4 tanks. They've got access to one. They've got a flow rate, which is we can all calculate at the moment will be for quite a while before that would get to the point of emptying that 270 tonnes. They've got access issues in terms of getting access to 2 settling tanks around the engine. And of course they've got the other tank which is pretty underwater. So they've just got to work their way through it, and we have to give them the room to do that.
Do you have a picture around that you could see here and get off a day? I mean, is it around the 68 or is it more than that? Because on that basis, obviously, we just go 10 days or more. That's a long time.
That would be a wonderful number to have indeed, but I don't think it's that exact in any way, shape or form. So.
What's the best case scenario then?
Sorry?
What's the best case scenario for how much you can get off a day?
Well, the range that I understand that the Archimedes pump works is anything between 0 and 70 tonnes an hour, but as you know, it's been much, much closer to 0 than 70 at this stage of the game.
Are they expecting to work through tonight again?
Subject to weather, yes. The weather is due to get a bit rougher there, not in the way of last week, where there was a very heavy swell, but they are expecting significant wave forming and wave action around the vessel, and it's coming from the north, which is the tougher angle, is the most exposed angle, or the worst angle, I understand. So there may be a situation where they have to be taken off tonight.
How is the oil today, and are there any risks with that?
There are, I would say there are always risks around what's going on in that ship. It's on a 21-degree list, and there are risks around the work they're doing, which is why there's a real focus on safety and evacuation plans. We've got the Sea Spy standing by, it's got night vision, but every evacuation plan has to have a number of options. We don't want to see anybody lose their lives on the ship.
How is that oil heated up?
The oil is heated up. Normally it's heated up using the engines from the engine room, and it's heated on a steam basis before it's run through the system. That was the way it was being done last week before the first storm. But as to how it's being done now, they're still working on that.
There have been reports today of that the ship had been mistaken for port flood. Sounded the ship had broken up. Has there been any structural deterioration, any change at all in its position or its structure?
My understanding is that it's reasonably steady state at the moment, but you know it's creaking and groaning all the time. So I don't think anybody would be putting any money on it.
Can I talk about financial thing?
Sorry,
Can I talk about a financial compensation?
we did have a discussion today about that potential, but I think we want to see a little bit more, get a bit more of a clearer understanding of what's actually going to happen over the next little while. We're talking to the Prime Minister, it's going to talk to the Chamber of Commerce tomorrow, but also the Minister of Fisheries has been talking to commercial fishermen, so we're gathering information and trying to get an estimate of the impact that it will have if it goes on for a significant period of time.
So, but at this point, there's still no commitment to that group.
No, it hasn't changed, we're still looking at it and assessing it.
But some businesses must now be starting to feel the effects of it. You know, we've had some business owners saying that you have to shut down and that sort of thing.
And the Chamber of Commerce are collecting that information at the moment and assessing it, and how long that will be and what their alternative plans are and all those sorts of things. And there'll be some that will be able to have alternative plans, and there'll be others that will actually obviously be directly affected. And we do need to have some sort of scope in that respect. It's not unlike, although on a smaller scale, the Christchurch situation where you do need the assistance of the locals to ascertain what the likely impacts are.
Would any compensation package though be likely to flow through businesses as opposed to, for example, individual help? Because that potentially would be the main area of input.
We're just trying to write it, obviously, at this session this afternoon. We just have to wait on that.
On the boat, what's your sense of chances of it making it through tonight or in the next few days?
One thing I've learned in the last couple of weeks is not try and estimate how the ship's going to behave in the weather conditions that are presented to it. Look, it's literally don't know, but I would stress this, that it is actually the stern 2/3 of the ship, which now contain all the oil, is quite precariously placed on the reef. So we're about 60 metres overhang off the back of the reef and about 90 metres sitting on the reef. The bit that keeps it balanced is the amount of air and flotation it gets in that back section. And that's changing, and there's significant amounts of water in the engine room, including at some points up to 2 metres deep. So it is variable and very dangerous, and these guys are just working to get as much oil off it as they can, and also mitigating what happens with the oil that's still on the ship. And they still have the caps and the ability to close all the vents should they be evacuated from the ship.
So what's the advice if the ship sinks, or the back end falls off, and it's for it to sink, for it to float?
Certainly, that advice again is quite changeable. The latest understanding I have is that it would struggle to float for very long because of the way that the ballast and the weight is set up, and it may well just simply sink. They would still attempt probably to guide it to a slightly more shallow area, which would give better access to it later. But again, these are just highly variable situations.
What's the expectations of what would happen to the oil in the tanks?
There's a range of possibilities. right through from a fair bit of it stays inside the tanks through to losing some if there's a breach in one of the tanks. Just to give you a bit of an indication of that, the number 3 tank on the port side was breached in the last storm. They had successfully moved the oil from that tank into the number 5 tank before that storm. Otherwise, we would have had 350 odd extra tonnes in the water at that point. But that's where the crack has occurred, right across that number 3 tank.
Can you explain why in those early stages, this relates to the speed at which the rescue services are able to move, why it was possible to move the oil back into another tank? It flowed sufficiently for that, but not sufficiently to be able to pump it off the ship.
No, it's not the flow. They actually did heat the oil in those tanks. They had 3 things, as I understand it, they were seeking to do in that first crucial few days. One is to get the oil from the front tanks to the rear tanks for 2 reasons, because the front part of the ship was more vulnerable, and we found that out to be true because that's where the cracks have occurred. And then, of course, the number 5 tanks were staging posts to then remove the oil from the ship, because the only way to remove the oil is with a barge or a boat off to the rear. And then the limiting factors to which they did in what order is the piping systems in the ship and what they can jury-rig to get the oil from one part to another. So it's simply a case of working in parallel and trying to achieve a range of things, including getting the oil shipped at Andover.
But I thought one of the reasons that the guy who offered the 2 barges, one of the reasons it wasn't accepted was the oil wasn't able to flow into his barges. That's not the case then. It could flow into the rear tanks, but not out of it.
Not familiar with that. The reality with the chap in the barges, which of course Maritime New Zealand had access to, is, as I've said a number of times, my understanding is that availability of a place to put the oil was not the limiting factor. It was the ability to pump the oil from the ship into that, if you like, receptacle. And the preferred receiving barge would be one that is pretty robust. The Awanuia was the first preference. They did have those other ones available to them and 1 or 2 other options, but that was their preference. As I say, the arrival of the Awanuia, which I think from memory was around the Saturday, was not a limiting factor because they weren't ready to pump before then anyway.
How much of the $4 million oil industry levy can be used to go towards the clean-up costs? Can the whole take the whole thing or take some of it?
Yeah, they could use up the whole lot, but then obviously you'd have to start building it up again, but that's entirely possible, yes.
Can you increase the
That's one option that we look at. Yeah, it can be done. We're in the process of actually looking at an increase when this occurred, and that is an option going forward.
Something you consider soon?
I think we'll consider a range of options to make sure that the absolute minimum is met by the taxpayers.
What about this idea of more commission or commission inquiry?
We've said we'll have, a number of times in the last few days, we will have a look at it obviously afterwards in terms of getting somebody independent to run the law over it. Exactly what form that inquiry will take is just good.
Just to clarify on the amount of oil pumped off, so there was 64 in this go and 10 tonnes in the first.
That's correct.
So about 75 of it.
Yeah, so if you count it back from 1350 roughly, then we've got a way to go.
What realistically do you think are the chances of getting you out of the oil?
I don't rate them particularly highly, but I think it's a case of getting everything off that you can. This is just my view on the land, because I think there's still quite a lot of risk around where that ship stays where it is. And then it's a case of capping and sealing what's there, and particularly if it starts to break up.
So potentially it could remain on the ship for maybe months or
Well, it could remain on the ship for some time, absolutely. And that's one of the possible scenarios. They can still seek to obtain oil in those situations. But of course, the deeper you go, the more difficult it is and the challenge it is. But those are all options that are on the table depending on what happens to the ship. As I understand it, that's how the salvage works. They just keep using the options for what, in terms of the issues that are placed in front of them.
But if the tanks were kept concealed and it was sort of contained, does the ship just stay on the reef for the interim, and is the next step removing the ship, or would it be sunk,
Well, as long as the ship remains on the reef, they would expect to keep going back there to pump more oil off the ship, because that's definitely the preferable way. So in terms of other options, it would actually really come about because that rear section of the ship has effectively come off the reef and either sunk where it is or sunk somewhere else. At that point, they would look at other options for how they would pump it out.
As far as the containers are concerned, have you got any plans to remove those?
The absolute focus at this time is on the oil. If you said you were going to move the containers, but they just have to stop the oil recovery because the containers, as you will see, are right across the deck in a very difficult situation. You have to access, I understand, from close to the rear of the ship because that's how you get to other ships alongside. So you're effectively in a situation where it's one or the other at this point.
So it sounds as if you don't have any current plans. Have you got any long-term plans to do that, or is it just
The
you can
salvage
never get
team-
all the oil out, so you're never going to do anything with it until?
I know the salvage team will undoubtedly want to recover the containers, but we've got a fair bit of time to go before we're in that phase, I think. And it is possible that more containers could be lost overboard this evening, depending on the wind.
Will it be our priority, should regulation be signed up to the public?
Well, look, I think that's absolutely a priority in the current context. And as I said to you last night, it was pretty frustrating to find out that we weren't able to do that full amount when I discovered it last week.
The 24 million, it brings some saying, why limited to 24 and simply which is
Well, it's based, as I understand it, on calculation on the size of the ship, and that's exactly why it is the way that it is. So it goes up with the size of the ship and the size of the risk, as I understand it. And there are different conventions for different aspects. So, for example, oil tanks are covered separately to cargo ships.
So that figure specifically relates to the cleanup though, doesn't it?
That's correct.
It doesn't, the salvage costs don't come out.
That's right, the salvage costs are separate and to the owner's account.
Have you got to the bottom of why that was never passed, ratified?
There's a few people you could ask about that. The change to the convention was proposed by the IMO in 1996, and how it works is that countries then sign up to it, and New Zealand is one of those countries, and then once a certain number of countries have signed up, it becomes the law, and that's the new rule. That happened in 2004, and became active at that point. The previous government finally in 2008 proposed an update of the Maritime Transport Law that would have incorporated that change. That was passed in policy in 2008 and assigned a legislative priority of 5. I think that's 5 out of 5 being the low end. Then it was elected and passed over to the new government. Unfortunately, if we've gone back and read the briefings to incoming ministers, it wasn't specific enough about the nature of that convention update. We didn't update. We lifted the priority to a 4, but didn't get it passed in the current term. I have to say I'm going to go back and have asked officials to go back and look at whether we can change these things by regulation rather than time in the House. Certainly some countries do it that way, but the New Zealand law is not written that way.
What priority do you think it has now on the legislative?
I'd say it's significantly above priority 4 for the incoming government. I think we could be confident about that.